Forced marriage and child marriage present across communities and cause immediate and lifelong harm on many individuals in the United States and around the world. Attorneys have an important role to play in the prevention of and response to forced marriage and child marriage cases in the U.S., whether they involve children or adults. This field of practice, however, is still new, and the legal possibilities and the challenges differ from state to state. Now, the role of skilled family law practitioners familiar with the dynamics of forced marriage could not be more important. Today, we are delighted to have 4 experts in the field to share their experience, skills, and knowledge in forced marriage and child marriage cases in the United States and beyond. Our speakers for today's webinar are Tahirih Villegas, who is the Forced Marriage Initiative Manager at Tahirih Justice Center, and Mary Carmen Gaza, Chief of Programs from Tahirih Justice Center, and Bushra Hussain, who is the Program Director of Manhattan Non-Residential Services and the Sanctuary for Families. And last speaker, Caroline Gross-Hans, Senior Staff Attorney, Campus Advocates Project, and Sanctuary for Families as well. Okay, without further ado, I will turn over to Malik Ahmed to start on the webinar today. Thank you for being here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mari Carmen Garza. I'm the Chief of Programs at the Tahirih Justice Center. I've been at the Tahirih Justice Center for just under 2 years. And prior to coming to Tahirih for 21 years, I worked for an organization called Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, where I focused my practice on complex family law matters in 68 counties along the Texas-Mexico border. Along with me is Tahirih Villegas. And Tahirih, if you could just introduce yourself briefly.
Thank you so much, Mari Carmen. Hi, everyone. My name is Tahirih Villegas, and I serve at Tahirih as the Program Manager for the Forced Marriage Initiative. And in my role, I work with survivors across the nation, service providers, as well as lots of training and education. Previous to coming to Tahirih, I worked directly with survivors of domestic and sexual violence in different formats in organizations in the state of Florida. I'll pass it to Bushra to do an introduction.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bushra Hussain, and I'm a Program Director of Manhattan Non-Residential Services at Sanctuary for Families. I am probably the only non-attorney here. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I've also had my doctorate in social work. And, my primary role now, I've been with the agency for over 15 years. And through the course of my time, I've worked with many immigrant survivors, particularly South Asian survivors of intimate partner violence and other forms of gender-based violence. And right now, I provide counseling services to survivors who are at risk of experiencing a forced marriage. And really through the counseling process, we're uncovering a lot of feelings of guilt and shame, and working through those to figure out alternative options to their situations, while also maintaining safety planning and connecting survivors to other service providers who can really inform them of their rights. And I'm really excited to be here because it's so important to share a lot of the complex needs that are faced by forced and child marriage survivors. And I'm also here with my colleague, and I'll pass it along to Caroline Gross-Hans.
Hi, everyone. Caroline Gross-Hans. I'm a senior staff attorney with the Campus Advocates Project at Sanctuary for Families. Prior to coming to Sanctuary, my background is primarily in criminal defense work, and what I do now is really work with student survivors, mostly of the college age and graduate level, who are experiencing gender violence and helping them navigate the criminal system, the family court system, and also the administrative Title IX system on their college campuses. And so in this work, we've seen a great deal of overlap with forced marriage survivors, and we'll get into that more in a little bit. But because of that, at Sanctuary, I also have been involved in co-chairing the Forced Marriage Advocacy Committee. I'm excited to be here with you today and share some of the experiences and work that we have.
Thank you, Bushra and Caroline. Just to talk briefly a little bit more about what we do at Tahirih. The Tahirih Justice Center is a national nonprofit organization that provides client-centered, holistic legal representation to immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. And we do this from 5 different locations across the United States. We're in Falls Church, Virginia. We're in Baltimore, Maryland. We're in Atlanta, Georgia, in Houston, Texas, where I'm located, and also in San Bruno, California. We offer a broad range of legal services at Tahirih, starting with immigration law for survivors of gender-based violence, but we also work on the family law aspect to make sure that clients obtain the safety that they need, that they're able to secure divorces or protection orders, that they need to keep themselves and their children safe. We also engage in appellate litigation and impact litigation. And then, of course, one of the reasons why we're here today is our Forced Marriage Initiative, which is led by Halit. And this is one of our only nationwide programs, really, where it does not matter where a survivor may be. If they're facing forced marriage, we are able to assist regardless of where they are in the country. And all of these services that we do, we also accompany with case management social services to make sure that our clients are able to access the service that they desperately need, aside from the legal part of the work that we do. And although we do not do medical services directly, we do help clients connect to both medical and mental health services that they need during the course of their work with us.
And so those of you who do not know, Sanctuary for Families, we are a gender-based violence organization. We are based in New York City, and we provide services to adults and children who have experienced or witnessed forms of gender-based violence. So that includes intimate partner violence, trafficking, forced marriage, female genital mutilation. We offer, clinical and legal services. So we provide counseling to adults and children. And on top of that, we have an entire residential services program for those who are in immediate danger, an entire legal department that works on orders of protection, custody, visitation, immigration, trafficking, and divorce. And all of those are free. We also have an economic empowerment program that is really, that's helping survivors get back into the workforce, helping them to build skills in learning computer skills or just understanding the job market. We also provide case management and a lot of outreach services.
Thanks, everyone. And just a special thank you, special mention to the ABA's resolution urging the government at all levels in the U.S. to amend existing laws or to enact new laws to prevent forced marriage. And so before we begin, we just wanted to thank the ABA for the support with this issue. And so moving on to our agenda, we'll begin the first half or the first set of slides, giving an overview of this issue, or the research that we know about the U.S. We'll go into the tactics, warning signs, family dynamics that are important for folks to understand when working with survivors of forced marriage. We will have a short break right before we get into our legal landscape. From there, we'll have more information regarding child marriage, another short break, and then we'll close with creative advocacy and going into legal strategies and case examples. You'll see that I'll come on and off screen as I'm unable to see the chat when I'm on, and so I'll be on and off throughout the presentation so I can take a look at the chat. And so a little bit more about the program that I manage, which is the Forced Marriage Initiative. This program was created in 2011 at Tahirih, really to increase a response to galvanize a response to this issue in the United States. Our program is multifaceted. We engage in legal and policy research, lots of training and education like today, and most importantly is providing direct services. So we work directly with survivors who are wanting to leave a marriage that was forced, or are contacting us because they know a marriage is coming. And so if you'd like to learn more about our program, I encourage you to take a look at the preventforcedmarriage.org website, or you're more than welcome to write us at fmi@tahirih.org. Okay, and so to get started, what is forced marriage? And I love if folks have worked on this issue before, would love to know, please use the chat, or if you're totally new to this issue, we'd love to know, who is here and your level of knowledge or expertise with this type of harm. And so for all of us to be really on the same page, we'll start with definitions. And what you see on the screen are the definitions that ground us in the work that we do. And so a forced marriage is a marriage where one or both people do not or cannot consent to the marriage. And this typically involves elements of force, elements of fraud, and elements of coercion. Forced marriage is not arranged marriage in which families may take the lead, but the ultimate choice really remains with the individual or the individuals. And when we're talking about choice, we really are talking about consent, and consent at every stage of the process. And so it should be, yes, the person can freely express their wishes, they freely can express their opinions, and that is without fear, without negative consequences. Yes, they want to get married. So the idea of marriage is also a yes. They want to get married to the person they're being introduced to. And yes, to the timing, right? We want to get married right now, or the timeline that has been discussed. And we see cases from time to time where, a client tells us, I didn't mind the idea of my parents being involved in my marriage process, but they told me I could wait until college was over and I'm still in high school and they're moving forward. And it's at that time, right, where we're seeing, change, where we're seeing consent be dismissed, where we're seeing the timeline be different than what the survivor thought. I'll pass it to my colleague Bushra to continue this conversation.
All right, thank you, Halit. So back in 2015, Sanctuary for Families and Arab American Family Support Center created this diagram that you see on the right-hand side. Like Halit was talking about, it really helps to demonstrate how a forced marriage can be understood as one end of a continuum, right? So just like in an intimate partner violence and other forms of gender-based violence, dynamics of power and control can shift over time. And it can occur before or after a marriage happens. And it really sort of, when there is the presence of power and control dynamics, including what we have listed here: pressure, fear of ostracism, deception, fraud, coercion, threats, and physical violence, right? So you're seeing that an arranged marriage could become forced, and also a love marriage. And I will talk more about that in the next slide. So here is this marriage continuum. It's a great psychoeducational tool that can be used with both service providers and survivors to show how an arranged marriage could become forced. And just like the power and control wheel is used with intimate partner violence or domestic violence survivors, the continuum helps forced marriage survivors to identify their experiences and see where they are on the continuum given their circumstances. So even though, and at Sanctuary and a lot of other organizations, we do not see arranged marriage as being abusive in practice, you'll notice that the beginning stages 1 through 3, show how an arranged marriage can initially maybe be misleading through subtle coercion tactics and could become forced, right? And you'll also notice that once you cross stage 4, more overt abuse and violent tactics are used, which helps to clarify the stark difference between subtle coercive tactics to more obvious forms of emotional abuse and physical violence. And so for many of the survivors that I see in counseling, I have them take a look at this continuum week after week. And every week they're asked to identify which stage they're at. And so in 1 week, we could be at stage 3, and then another week we could be at stage 7. And it's really helpful as a service provider to know how the survivor identifies their situation, as well as indicating what safety planning steps can be taken. All right. And this was a continuum that was also created by Vidyashree and Raja back in 2013. So I do want to say, I cannot take credit for this, but again, it's a really lovely diagram, and, it really helps survivors to understand their experience. Next slide. And let me show you. So at Sanctuary, what we also noticed, we created a tool to show how a love marriage. And so for those who are not familiar, it shows how a love marriage could become forced. And the love marriage is a term that's used in many communities that refers to a marriage in which, it's decided by the couple with or without their consulting with their families, but also how a love marriage could become forced, right? So similar to the marriage continuum that I showed you earlier, the stages show subtle coercive tactics used by the partners. So again, initially, in the other diagram, we're looking at family involvement, maybe possibly community involvement. And here in this one, we're looking at how a partner could coerce an individual into a forced marriage, right? So you're noticing again, after stage 4, where there are darker shaded boxes, there's more overt abuse and violent tactics that are used, which are really similar to tactics that are used in intimate partner violence and trafficking situations.
Thank you, Bushra. And before I move forward, I did see that folks are naming that there is a box that is opening up and covers the slide. It seems that perhaps when I'm clicking on the Q&A, that it's actually blocking the slides for some reason. And so I won't be able to continue to look at the Q&A. So if my colleagues can take a peek, that would be really helpful here and there, as I know that folks are commenting. And if folks are still seeing an issue with the slides, please do let us know and we can try to reset. Okay, and so one of the questions that we typically get when we are conducting this type of training is, does forced marriage really happen in the United States? And the short answer to that is that, forced marriage is a global issue, and the US is part of that globe. And so in 2011 at Tahirih, we conducted a survey to take a look at this issue. And what we learned from that survey, we learned about 3,000 known or suspected cases of forced marriage. We also learned that service providers were aware that other cases were not coming to the light for many different reasons. Folks were not necessarily, reporting. So we know that number was just the tip of the iceberg. And more regarding our findings about who is impacted or who is a victim of forced marriage, that hopefully can make us think twice when we think about who that person could be. The survey identified that families came from at least 56 countries, and some of the families did not have any immigrant tie whatsoever. The survey also identified diverse religious backgrounds, as well as families where religion was not a case-specific motivation for the forced marriage. Throughout the presentation, we are using gender language, but we do serve, folks of various identities. But the majority of the victims that were listed in the survey, and it is true today of our program, the majority of those who are facing unique challenges are women and girls. The survey also identified that folks were facing marriages both in the US and abroad, and many were under the age of 18. And those who are under the age of 18 can be challenging to support, but we will talk further about unique ways of providing support. Bushra, would you like to share more here?
Yes. So, and then, again, like Halitz is mentioning, there are very limited studies, and so on the issue of forced marriage, but forced marriage is widely recognized to be underreported. And so therefore accurate information about the scale of the problem is really difficult to report, particularly in the United States. And so there are a few studies, and I'll mention a few. Give me 1 second, I'm sorry. The Urban Institute conducted an exploratory study that was focusing on the nature of forced marriage. And they were looking particularly in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and they used the Google Consumer Survey, which, it's a sample of people visiting websites and asking them questions. And again, these are mostly adults. And they estimated that there was a prevalence rate of forced marriage in the United States at 11.2. And when you break that down in terms of the 11% percentile, you're looking at a 7% of respondents who identified that they were in a forced marriage. Then you have 3% of respondents who had mentioned that they are faced or experienced a forced marriage, but no longer married to that person, and a 1% of respondents reporting being threatened with a forced marriage. So again, little by little, we're getting a little bit more of information and understanding of the data that's there. But again, primarily because oftentimes we see forced marriage as being an issue that is not touched in the United States. And we're hoping that this is really going to open your eyes in terms of seeing that we are seeing a lot of cases, and there are slowly by slowly some more research, and I'll share a little bit more later on child marriage research as well. And so, yes, as I mentioned, forced marriage is underreported, and most service providers, and even those who are at risk of a forced marriage, or even survivors that are coming in, see the issue as a cultural issue, right? And they don't see these as forms of gender-based violence. And so similar to the domestic violence movement, a lot of people believe that the situations, that are happening behind closed doors in people's homes, is really their business. And like IPV survivors, intimate partner violence survivors, and many forced marriage survivors are afraid of getting their family members into trouble, right? By taking their families to court or seeking legal protection. And again, what really makes forced marriage and child marriage even more difficult to study, is the ongoing conflation, right? Confusion between arranged and forced, right? And service providers and those at risk of a forced marriage see these oftentimes as the same. I always say to my clients, I feel like I'm coining a new term, right? And it is a new term for many service providers and for clients who are coming in. And then the other issue that we're noticing is that many organizations and service providers don't have a working definition of forced marriage, right? So, or child marriage. And so we don't, how are you able to assess? So they don't have trainings, they don't know how to assess for forced or child marriage. So it's really important, right, for us to be here today is to really equip service providers with knowledge about the nature of forced marriage, and how it differs from arranged marriage, and so that service providers aren't overlooking the dangers of forced and child marriage, and really viewing it and not viewing it as a culturally normative practice. And the other issue that we see is, unfortunately, forced marriage occurs alongside other forms or practices of gender violence, right? So that includes like female genital mutilation, FGM, sexual assault, trafficking, domestic violence, which, victims will report first. And we're noticing that forced marriage, often precedes a lot of these other forms of gender-based violence. So it's really important to figure out ways where we can be preventive and also break these cycles of violence.
Thanks, Bushra. And just to complement what you have shared, what we have tried to do with this slide is highlight for folks how root causes that are present across communities, across societies, that large circle that you see on the graphic, can be the cause, the root cause for what you see on that magnifying glass, that individual, that family level trigger that can be the case specific motivation for the marriage to occur. So let's say you come from a society, a community where control over female sexuality is prevalent, and your specific family disapproves of engaging in sexual activity, or even the perception of engaging in sexual activity before marriage. That for your particular family may be that case specific dynamic for the marriage to move forward. Should I really like to highlight some other motives?
And just to expand on that, some of the motives that we've seen that could increase a person's risk for forced marriage and make it an even more urgent situation are things like if one of the parent dies, especially the father, there might be increased pressure for one of the daughters in the family then to marry so that they can have some financial stability or other protections for the family. Similarly, if an older sibling refuses to marry, then there could be increased pressure on a younger sibling to marry. If someone discloses sexual abuse, they may be forced to marry because, you know, the idea would be to keep that a secret and for that not to be something that's appropriate or that can get out. And so they need to marry to kind of cover that up and do it quickly. Additionally, if it becomes known that someone is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning, they may be forced into marriage. Appeasing a family dispute can be another reason why someone would be forced into marriage. Also, as individuals in certain communities start to get older, you know, there's something that can be thought of as an unmarriageable age, meaning that, you know, they're getting older and they need to marry quickly. And that can kind of be like a cultural norm within the community. And so there can be an urgency and thus they could be forced into a marriage for that reason. And additionally, if someone is found out to be in a relationship with someone and that isn't an approved relationship for the family, then they may be forced into marrying someone else that is approved by the family. And so those are just some of the things that we've seen that could force a marriage and cause it to be a bit of a more urgent situation. If we want to go to the next slide, you can see some of the tactics that are sometimes used. So, you know, it can be a variety of things, emotional abuse, psychological manipulation, threats of disownment or exclusion from the community. So sometimes, you know, things are said like, if you don't marry, you're going to destroy your family's honor, you'll be excluded from the family, and there'll be, you know, there could even possibly be real examples where an individual has seen this happen to others. So it's a real threat. You'll be ridiculed or ostracized by the community. Some people, parents will even threaten their own lives and say, you know, if you don't marry this person, I'll commit suicide, or will marry off your younger sister instead, as an example, or they'll threaten the safety of a family member like mom. So if you don't marry, you know, I'll divorce your mother and send her back to the home country. And these are just some of the many examples that can be used to manipulate people in these situations and make them feel like they have no choice but to say yes. And if we go to the next slide, just expanding on that further, you know, other things that we see are fraud and deception. So, you know, it's common for the person being forced into marriage to not necessarily know that this is going to happen and, you know, and not be kept in the loop. And then all of a sudden, in a very short period of time, be told that this is what's happening and be forced into doing this. They may have their immigration documents taken from them, you know, to prohibit their moving, or they may be forced to stay within the home, physically forced, or technology taken away from them, like phones or internet access, so that they're further isolated from leaving the home. There may be actual threats of physical violence or death if they don't do this. We've also seen in some of our casework that individuals are sometimes kidnapped from abroad and brought to the US and then forced into marriage here. And again, you know, in that situation, it's very difficult for the client if they are here illegally, if they don't have proper papers, you know, or if they do and their papers are being kept from them for them to get out of a situation like that. Also, we have had clients who have tried to escape situations like this, and they will be harassed or stalked by their family members and brought back into the community, brought back into the home, so that they will go forward with this marriage. So those are all some of the things that we've seen. And so, you know, as you think about this as a practitioner, if there are warning signs that a forced marriage may be taking place, this is a list of some of the questions that you may want to ask, that Tahirih actually had put together, you know, and just to try and get a sense, is this something that the person has a choice in, like that spectrum that Busher showed us earlier, or is this a situation where they have no choice but to say yes, whether it be because of physical abuse that's being, you know, that's occurring, or more psychological manipulation that's occurring.
All right, thank you, Caroline. You know, and I wanted to share a little bit about some of the, you know, the anecdotal, but also information that we're getting through research. You know, for a while, a lot of researchers had reported that forced and child marriages survivors had limited or no history of abuse, right? And really, in my experience, I've noticed that, you know, forced and child marriage survivors have experienced or witnessed trauma as children, you know, and which has been internalized from an early age and really sort of exacerbates a lot of these feelings of guilt and shame. And so, which is why they feel very easily coerced into these relationships. And really, as service providers, it's important to sort of dig deeper and understand the possible impacts of years of generational challenges within the family and how that gets passed down from those who directly experience it to subsequent generations, right? This really helps. You know, I feel like this will help service providers to better understand the survivor and to be more trauma informed. I know there's a lot of talk about trauma informed lawyering, right? And sort of like very similar to what you would be doing with domestic violence or IPV or other gender-based violence survivors, you want to have that trauma-informed approach, right? So you want to look, you know, for example, like you want to ask kind of a little bit like what Caroline just mentioned, you know, are there other people, you know, how have others been married, have other cousins or extended family members, and what happens to those who go against these family and cultural norms? And here in this slide, I've really sort of given you a basic definition of intergenerational trauma, right? And sort of like how does that impact? So if there's already trauma that's happened to the parents or then are being passed down to the children, and also just thinking about if, you know, if a lot of our forced marriage survivors have experienced adverse childhood experiences, then what does that mean for them, right? Because as attorneys who might represent them in cases, that it will come out in you know, in your work with them. Right. And so I also wanted to just touch on the adverse childhood experience study. I'm sure many of you guys have heard of it and are familiar with the historic ACE study that was conducted in 95 through 97 with like over 17,000 adults who were screened and found that, and, you know, exposure to abuse or household dysfunction really, you know, increased developing long-term psychiatric and medical health conditions for individuals in adulthood. So, you know, again, this ACE study really helps support the notion that children who experience traumatic experiences are more likely to develop PTSD and other trauma symptoms. And, you know, and the forced marriage survivors that I see, you know, have PTSD symptoms. And the forced marriage, you know, is not the first time in my experience that survivors are asked to put the needs of their family above their own. You know, there are often many experiences before the forced marriage, before the child marriage. Usually that happens in childhood. And we could, you know, consider those adverse childhood experiences that leaves the survivor with maladaptive beliefs, right? So it changes their perception of themselves, of the world, that they carry throughout their lives. And so really, that's really sort of the work that I do in counseling, is trying to address those. And so as a result, the survivor feels pressure to make decisions that uphold family honor instead of really attending to their own needs and to their own safety. And I'll talk more about, you know, what that looks like for both child and forced marriage survivors.
Thank you, Bushra. And just a reminder for folks, I know it's been named already, but forced marriage really intersects with many forms of gender-based violence, and forced marriage is on its own a form of violence. The very onset of that marriage, the marriage itself really is an act of violence, that marriage implies a great deal of power imbalance in that relationship. And so important to highlight here as you think about folks who you may be serving, other harms that they may be naming to you, to think about if this question regarding forced marriage is being asked, or if we're looking deeper to ensure that we are addressing all the needs that the person may be having. I know that quote on the bottom left really speaks to me. When I was doing my work at the Domestic Violence Center, I never asked about this issue. And now looking back, now having this knowledge, I do believe that I worked with survivors who were also facing this type of harm, or who were in relationships that were forced. But again, we just never asked. It was not part of our intake process. So I am going to skip right through these slides, just again, have them here to uplift what my colleagues have shared earlier regarding tactics and warning signs and red flags. But moving forward, I'll pass it back to you.
All right, thank you, Halitz. Again, as we're viewing forced marriage as a form of gender-based violence, we're seeing, forced marriage as a process rather than, an isolated incident that allows the dynamics of this abuse to be more visible in the long-term process. But really also we want to look at it as, how is the socialization starting in early childhood? There's a lot of research that's going on abroad that's looking at the role of mothers as key to socialization, right? Mothers play an important role in the transmission of appropriate cultural values. They create, that are largely created in this patriarchal structure, right? So many clients have discussed or have shared the role their mothers play in introducing the idea of marriage to them as young as children or adolescents. And they have endured years of trauma leading up to the actual event of the marriage. But it's really important, right? Because it's also can be very problematic, right? To recognize the position of women as mothers as being responsible for the perpetration of forced marriage when they're really working within the cultural script, right? Which is, on the confines of like the patriarchal control that is then coercing them to force their children to marry. So really seeing mothers as reproducing the demands of patriarchy, right? Who are also victims in all of this, right? And one of the other connections that we're also noticing is that many of the survivors have also witnessed intimate partner violence in the home, right? And so witnessing IPV, intimate partner violence in the home, is a ACE, right? So we talked about the adverse childhood experiences, which then could result in long-term psychiatric and health issues, right, for adults. And many children who grow up witnessing intimate partner violence in the home often become the caregiver, right? They become parentified. They're forced to assume adult responsibilities before they're ready to do so. And so a lot of our forced marriage survivors have a hard time building trust, and they're parentified and to cope with these difficult situations. And they're developing a lot of these mental health and PTSD symptoms. So again, we're seeing this correlation, we're seeing this connection, and the connection to all of the other literature that we know about when we're thinking about other forms of gender-based violence. So I just wanted to add that here. And if we move on to the next slide, implications. So what does that mean? So I think about how trauma-informed care or trauma-informed lawyering is an important approach in working with forced marriage survivors. And forced and child marriage survivors are not regarded as like autonomous beings, but they're like under the ownership of their natal family, and then the marriage, the family that they marry into. So it's really important to take time, for survivors to make it takes time for survivors to make decisions and also acknowledge when they do not want to take steps, right? We must make, keep forced marriage survivors at the heart of the work and remember what, their voices and what their experiences are and what we're learning from them. I also recognize that legislation, and we'll talk about the lack of or some that is coming up, right? Or work that's happening is not sufficient to just tackle the issue of forced marriage alone. And so it's really important to look at preventative community level education, which is key to achieving the cultural shift that's required to combat and to address forced and child marriage issues. And so that's really also why we're here, to kind of be able to talk more about the issue, hopefully educating you all, and then educating others through this process and your clients that you're going to serve.
Thanks, Bushra. And as we think about the remedies, as we think about the ways that we are asked by the survivors we work with for help, often some of these remedies are not, legal ones. And though we're going to speak to some of those legal remedies moving forward, I think it's important to name what we often see. Often when folks are contacting us, they are looking or needing safe shelter. Often they are unable to remain with family, and moving to another home within the familial structure is still unsafe, as the threats and the pushes for the forced marriage are coming from different folks within the family or within the community. When working with survivors and when we're able to identify safe shelter, often folks are needing a name change, a fear that they're going to be found. At times, families can be relentless in looking for the young girl or the woman who's left the home, and so that is advocacy that we are doing on their behalf. The Social Security number change is also very common. If your family has always kept your documentation, and they know your identity, right? And so finding ways of helping the survivors we work with remain safe is really important. Relocation is a big one as well. Overseas repatriations and in partnership with the Department of State. It's also common when we're working with folks who are wanting to return to the U.S. and returning to the state where they are from is not necessarily safe. And so working together with the survivor and thinking about where it would be safe and working in partnership with other organizations to identify these safe locations is important. And last but not least, we see a lot of need for advocacy for education. A lot of the young women who I work with and my colleagues work with as well are wanting to pursue their education or to continue their education. And so liaising with different offices at the university level, state college level is incredibly important. And as we think about how to support those who we work with and what is success to them, what is justice in their journey to healing, and often we play a role in really liaising, advocating so that they are able to achieve the goals that they set for themselves.
Just to touch on what Halit's just mentioned, some other, tips and things to think about. She talked about going into shelter, the possibility of DV shelter. So, oftentimes, again, like I mentioned, not many people are aware of the term forced marriage. And so we do find a lot of our survivors being turned away. The other issue that might come up in terms of like whether a child's marriage survivor could go in, or those, a child marriage survivor who's at risk could go into a DV shelter. You also need to think about state laws. So I know in New York, children as young as 16 can enter a domestic violence shelter, but it also differs state by state. So I really encourage you to think about or to ask other DV organizations in your area, how young can a person be to go into a domestic violence shelter? Can they be emancipated and receive public benefits? Because that's the major challenge, right? Can they really survive on their own? Obviously, of course, you want to remind a person that marriage requires consent. And this is particularly for adult survivors, and again, but when we think about children, the question of consent, we do feel like this is a form of abuse and neglect. If informing the client or the person that he or she can call 911. And again, this has been an ongoing challenge here and even in New York. We've been working on trying to train domestic violence police officers about this issue and understanding, the difficult, complex needs of forced and child marriage survivors, because oftentimes they are turned away or they're told to go to family court. And again, we'll talk later. Caroline and this team is going to really share more about some cases where we've had some challenges, just even sort of doing that. Very similar to working with other forms of gender-based violence survivors, like identifying an escape route or a safe person that they could maybe stay with. And if a child or an adult is at risk of going abroad, right? Also looking into whether or not if their travel itinerary can be documented with the U.S. Department of State for overseas citizens. So again, this is only eligible for those who have legal status, for green card U.S. citizen holders. And so you notice we have different phone numbers, and we've done that. We have, documented a lot of our clients who are maybe at risk of a forced or child marriage abroad. And then also looking at the state laws, which we'll talk later presentation about what the state laws say, particularly around the issue of child marriage. You'd be surprised. There's still a lot of states in which there is no minimum age of marriage, and that could be very problematic. And then obviously working with the minor, right? So when you're working with a child, notifying Child Protective Services. And we'll talk about some of the challenges and successes with that.
Thanks all. And now we'll have a brief 10-minute break before we get started into the legal landscape. So this is a great time for folks to get your break, get your snack, get your water. And if you'd like to use the chat feature to ask questions using the Q&A, we're happy to take a couple minutes and look at those. Otherwise, we'll be back in 10 minutes. Okay, are folks back? To my colleagues, I can't see if you are on, so maybe on mute, or folks can chime in on the chat to let me know that we are back. That would be great.
Everyone's back, Helitz.
Thank you so much, Maria Carmen. I appreciate it. And for those of you who are here with us today, I'd love to know where you're joining from. If you could use the chat, we'll love the engagement. And if you have worked on a case before or not, that would be helpful as we navigate these next few slides. And just a reminder that the Q&A is available. If you have questions that perhaps can be answered as we go along, feel free to use the Q&A. Otherwise, we can certainly take questions at the end. So pausing for a minute in case folks want to add there. Okay, and as we look to the legal landscape, we'll highlight how Canada, Australia, and the UK have all taken different approaches in their attempts at solving the issue of forced and child marriage in their countries. And we will just do a brief walk through these countries and their efforts to learn a bit about what those steps were and what we learned from them. And so starting with Canada, with the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act. This introduced sweeping changes to immigration law, criminal law, and marriage laws in Canada. No person under the age of 16 was allowed to marry, and it became illegal to celebrate, whether that be officiate, to aid, or to even participate in a marriage ceremony, knowing that one of the parties was being forced or was marrying against their will, or again, being younger than the age of 16. It also made it an offense to remove from Canada a person under 18 to marry in another country, to force that person to marry in another country. And so this act gained or provoked criticism, lots of activism, lots of debate, really starting with the name, thinking of tying forced marriage to the word barbaric or barbaric cultural practices, and really tying violence to culture and creating, or I should say, adding fuel to the fire to anti-immigrant sentiments, creating this us versus them dynamic that still, remains. So lots of debates with this, the title of this act, as well as, the criminal penalties, and thinking about those who actively participate in a marriage, thinking about the fact that often there are folks who may be victims themselves who do not have the ability to speak up, or they themselves could be harmed or unable to do anything, and just the participation or being there without any power is something that that also caused a lot of debate. When we look to Australia, their strategy at solving the issue of forced or child marriage was really to tie it to their efforts in ending human trafficking. And so for them, it is illegal to cause a person to enter a forced marriage and to be party to a forced marriage. Their laws carry, some heavy criminal penalties. You have 7 years of imprisonment, potentially 9 years. It is also a high penalty, 25 years imprisonment, if you are to take someone under the age of 18 overseas for the purposes of a forced marriage. And so with Australia, given that they linked the issue to human trafficking, they actually work very similar to the T visa in the US, meaning that services for survivors only really come with the participation with law enforcement, with that law enforcement, the survivor, working with law enforcement. And so it is treated as trafficking. And so we know from our work that often connecting with legal systems, with law enforcement is not necessarily something that survivors want. And we know from the next case example in the UK that there at times can be a deterrence to reporting when you have criminal charges. Not every survivor feels this way, but often it is a fear to think about what you sharing of what's happening, what will lead, to your parents or other members of your family to perhaps be arrested and be away for a long time. Looking at the UK, this may look, or I would say it's a more maybe a thoughtful outlook. They began with community conversations. They created what's called the Forced Marriage Unit, and this unit has a helpline that serves directly survivors of forced and child marriage. They have, caseworkers, they do outreach education, as well as handle those overseas repatriations directly with the forced marriage unit with those embassies. And so it is like a one-stop hub for survivors or folks who are facing this type of harm. When we move ahead to just last year, the Marriage and Civil Partnerships Act banned child marriage altogether. And the UK does have a unique protection order because it is a forced marriage specific protection order instead of utilizing the domestic violence or sexual violence or trafficking protection orders. They created one specifically for forced marriage. And an additional unique piece of this order is that it can also serve children. And so, and though this approach may look like a more thoughtful approach, even in every step of this process, we know from colleagues at various organizations in the UK that there was still controversy at the community level, right? And thinking about how these acts are implemented, how the unit is working, and again thinking about how criminal penalties can deter some survivors from reporting, from coming forward. And we know that that has happened as they have shared that with us. And so looking at the landscape in the United States, there isn't a forced marriage specific criminal law at the federal level. And Tahirih, as well as our partners, members of the Forced Marriage Working Group, we're thinking really carefully about what this could look like and if this is something that would be helpful. We like to discuss this, with partner organizations, community members, community-based organizations, survivors, really, and other experts to really think carefully about what would be helpful for survivors. Some can certainly find this helpful. Others, and a large chunk of folks who I work with often would like some civil remedies. Moving into the immigration space, there is no the de facto, minimum legal age for a U.S. citizen to sponsor a spouse is 18, but there isn't a minimum age for the foreign spouse. And we have seen some very concerning numbers, cases of very adults, older U.S. citizen men sponsoring very young girls. So lots of work to be done here as well. At the state level, we know of 9 states and 2 jurisdictions that have criminal offenses addressing forced marriage. And overall, we are mostly utilizing the federal, state criminal laws when it comes to domestic violence, that intersection of forced marriage with child abuse, stalking, kidnapping, and unlawful restraints. So thinking about what laws are available to us and how the abuse that our clients are facing, how we can utilize those laws to help them if that is what they are wanting or what they're hoping for. To continue the legal landscape in the US, a special mention to the most recent reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, which now includes forced marriage as a type of harm that again is intersecting with domestic violence, dating violence, sexual violence, stalking, and trafficking. And so we're hoping that now having forced marriage as part of VAWA can be a great step for victim services and legal assistance and those providers to think creatively as to how they can provide support to forced marriage survivors. All right, let's talk a little bit about child marriage, and I'll start by naming that at the Tahirih Justice Center, we do not equate every child marriage with a forced marriage. We do see a world where there could be two very mature 17-year-olds who are capable, are in love, they want to get married, and that may not necessarily be by force. But what we do know is that even in situations where folks under the age of 18 are marrying, the odds are really stacked against them, and for the most part, those marriages are not very successful. What we also know is that the majority of the child marriage cases in the United States are not that type of scenario, but they actually have some very concerning factors. The vast majority of the cases that we are aware of involve girls marrying much, much older adult men. At times, they are decades older. We also see discrepancies with the marriage age laws and the age of consent laws, as well as states that have parental consent exceptions for children to marry that we know can enable parental coercion, as for the most part, we're seeing parents being the key motivators for these marriages that may be forced. We also know that between the years 2000 and 2018, 300,000 minors were married. But we are happy to see that since 2016, since our work began in the state of Virginia, there have been 31 states that have conducted reforms to increase or to enhance their marriage laws, and 7 states, including where my colleagues are from, New York, have completely ended marriage under the age of 18. When thinking about working with minors, it is clear to us that there are lots of challenges in working with minors, and that those who are facing forced marriage, who are minors, really have at times, the most difficulties, because not only do they not know about their rights and options, but a lot of the systems are not set up to provide them support. And even when they are, many service providers are just not aware of the rights that a minor has. And so it's so important to be aware and to be able to educate. For the most part, minors lack the capacity or standing to initiate court action, or I should say in some states, law enforcement tends to defer to parents. So even if a young person is asking for help, they tend to maybe see them as problematic or just a runaway. They're causing problems. CPS, or Child Protective Services, may not quite see this issue as within scope of services. They may not be set up to help something that a minor knows is going to happen in the future, but it hasn't happened thus yet. Right? They have the limited ability to leave home, and even if they do leave home, often the youth shelters have an obligation to return minors to their parents, or to contact the parents, and or to contact Child Protective Services, which again may not see them as within scope of services, and more often than not, they're returned home. And what happens then, when someone who is a minor is asking for help and they're not successful, the family now knows that they are talking. They know that they have shared, family business. They know that something has to happen sooner rather than later before other systems become involved. And so there's a lot stacked against them when it comes to seeking help for themselves. pass it to my colleague to talk a little bit more about research here and a case study.
Great. Thank you, Halit. So here I just want to kind of make the connection of the impact of child marriage and how it relates to, how it impacts psychological health, right? So what we know about child marriage, it's associated with higher rates of sexually transmitted infections, HIV, cervical cancer, unwanted pregnancies, challenges in childbirth, discontinuation of an education. So I just wanted to share some recent research, and researchers Lestrade and others, they drew from like this national epidemiological survey on alcohol and related conditions. So between 2001 and 2002, and they had found a pool of about like 24,575 women who were part of this sample. And of that sample, 2,181 women were married at the age of 17 or younger, which then, had them conclude that there was a prevalence of child marriage among women in the United States at 8.9%. And then they interviewed those women and found that the rates of psychiatric disorders were higher for child marriage survivors, so those who had experienced a child marriage. And then just to touch on another study, McFarlane and others in 2016 interviewed 277 mothers who were in an IPV shelter and seeking legal services in Texas. They were given a forced marriage questionnaire as part of a 7-year study, and they found that 1 in 6 women reported a forced marriage attempt. 45% of those were experienced a child marriage under the age of 18, and 17% of them reported intimate partner violence preceding the marriage. So it's indicated in that same study, about 40% of child marriage survivors reported rape before the age of 18 and experiencing sexual violence by an intimate partner in their adolescence. So really, and another historic thing that McFarlane and others really sort of noted was the impact on the parent-child relationship. So looking at the child marriage survivor and their relationship now with their child, right? So they studied the parent-child relationship, and they found that mothers reported more likely to develop the same symptoms, right? So mothers reported like clinical and borderline symptoms of depression and anxiety, and their children were 7 times more likely to develop the same symptoms, right? So we're looking at how childhood traumas and the experience of child marriage has shown to negatively affect the dyadic relationship between the parent and the child is now developing more behavioral issues and clinical symptoms of depression and anxiety. Very clearly something, a lot of what we're seeing with intimate partner violence survivors, trafficking survivors. So it's really important to explore as service providers these childhood experiences, the impact on the survivor's perception of self-autonomy, which will really provide us insight into the help-seeking behaviors that fit the needs of forced and child marriage survivors. So I just really wanted to tie that in and really sort of show everyone the connection, right? And the continuation, a lot of the historical trauma and abuse that a lot of gender-based violence survivors experience, and how that really correlates with a lot of our forced and child marriage survivors. And we're going to follow it up with a case example.
So Far is one of the case examples that we wanted to uplift, and this is a minor who we helped at Sanctuary for Families. She initially came here with her family from Bangladesh, and it was an immigrant family, and when they came, they went to live with other family that were already in the United States. At the time, the person that she ultimately ended up being forced to marry was actually living in that home. And everything was fine initially, but over time, the family had more and more difficulty making ends meet here in the US. She was going to school, and couldn't afford books and things that she needed for school. And so it started off as reaching out to this person for financial support. And eventually he ended up actually paying rent for the family. And he proposed that in addition to be able to support them financially, that he could also get them immigration status if this individual, Farah, our client, married him. And so Farah, our client, was forced at a young age to marry him. It was a religious marriage. And, she had expressed to her mother, prior to him even asking or making any kind of proposal, that she didn't want to marry him, because at that time he was already starting to show some kind of interest in her. And she had told her mom that that's not something she ever wanted to do, marry him. But once the proposal came, she felt like she had no other choice, that this was something that her parents, wanted her to do, needed her to do to support the family, to get them immigration status, to financially continue to support the family. And so she went forward with the marriage. Prior to the marriage, as we've touched on, there was some sexual abuse from the person that she ultimately ended up marrying. And then once she was forced into the marriage, there continued to be sexual abuse. And, from Farah's perspective, they all were living under the same roof at the time. So she was living under the same, even after she was married, she was living in the same apartment that her parents were living in. And so in a lot of ways, it was understood that how could the parents not be aware of this abuse that was going on, in addition to the fact that they're the ones who initially forced her into this marriage. To give a little bit more background and to tie in some of the things that we've been talking about, Farah didn't share the abuse that occurred prior to the marriage with her mother or father, and her mother herself was someone who was who married at a very young age. And so that kind of goes back to some of that intergenerational trauma that we often see in these cases. And so Farah didn't necessarily feel as though she could share or, share the abuse that was going on, or that her mother understood the extent of why she didn't want to do this and why these things that were happening weren't okay. So ultimately, how this case came into the light is that someone at school found out that Farah was married, and they reported it to child welfare. The school reported it to child welfare. So if we want to go to the next slide, you can just see once child welfare became involved, they, one of the questions that comes up is who are they really investigating? And so in this case, they ultimately didn't investigate the family. There was some discussion about whether the family was going to be investigated, but ultimately that was not something that was a part of the case. The person that Farah was forced to marry was criminally charged, but the parents were never criminally charged. And so it leaves this question of, what role did the parents play in this, and what support can be given to them to, to try and help in this situation. So child welfare services did give them parenting classes, but it wasn't in a language that they could understand. And so, not much was being done to help them understand why this situation was problematic. And there also was concerns, as we tried to help this client in terms of communication, right? So she was still living within the family home. The family still didn't understand why this was problematic, that this marriage took place in the first place. And so one thing as we tried to work with the client is that just physically communicating with her was difficult, because her access to a telephone was through the family. And so often she would have to leave the home and actually borrow a friend's phone to be able to contact us. And then it became more complicated as we tried to help the client. So, she ultimately did apply for immigration status on her own through a T visa. So because a criminal case was brought against the abuser, against the person that she was married, she was able to apply for a T visa. But there was a lot of complications around that in the sense of how she was feeling about it with respect to her family. So she had to apply for a visa, but that meant her family couldn't get relief. And she was still living in the home with her family. And so her family didn't necessarily understand why they were being excluded. She was reaching out to us as her attorneys and asking for support for her family, but we had to continue to explain to her that we represented her and that it would be a conflict of interest for us to support the family. There also became a point in time when the abuser himself reached out to the family and was saying that he was he had a green card initially, that he was gonna get deported because of the criminal charges against him. And he wanted our client to reach out and file a petition with immigration, basically saying that she was complicit in this and that it was all really just a big misunderstanding, and she wanted this too. And again, the client is still living in the home while all of this is going on. She's a minor, she's a child, right? And so it's difficult for her to be in a position where she's saying no to those types of things. And so again, she's reaching out to us as her attorneys to try and help her navigate this, to talk to her parents, to give legal advice to her parents on how to respond to the request from the former husband. And those are all really challenging positions for our client to be in. And there's also, limits to what we can do. We have an obligation to our client, but beyond that, we really can't be advising the parents or anyone else on that. And, if she were to say anything to immigration, that would jeopardize her own immigration status. So there's a lot of challenges that come up as, for this is just an example, but a lot of challenges that come up as she tries to navigate this. And so ultimately, she was able to get, through the criminal case, she was able to get an order of protection against the abusive husband. She did get immigration status, like I said, for herself. And very recently, she has moved out of the home. And so she's no longer living with her parents. And she's trying to go to college. And so a lot of the support we're giving her now is trying to make that a real possibility for her to go to college. And, financially, that's very difficult. And so it's applying for a lot of different grants, like trying to get her access to a computer or books or, different ways that we can help support her in getting that college degree. Housing continues to be an issue for her. So she doesn't have, stable housing at this point, but that is something that we try and help our clients with. Sometimes moving into temporary shelters is an option. And sometimes for minor clients, we're also able to help them in New York State apply for child support. And so that can be a little bit tricky, but it's a newer remedy that we're trying. We're indicating that the child should actually get support from their parents. So their parents should actually pay them child support because they're no longer living at home, but they need the financial support from their parents. And so we've had some success in more recent cases in being able to get child support in cases like this, where a minor is a survivor of forced marriage. So other things to consider in ACS cases or cases involving Child Protective Services is that sometimes a family will navigate these challenges by actually sending the individual, our client, the person being forced into a marriage, out of state. So that way they can avoid Child Protective Services altogether. So sending that person out of state to live with other family members, and that way they can ensure that the marriage goes through. And so that can be really problematic when something like that happens. They also may, seek to isolate the child by homeschooling them and no longer having them actually go to school. Like I said, with the FAR case, we saw that in terms of cutting off communication or limiting communication to anyone outside of the home. And so again, this can be a tactic to try and make sure that this marriage goes through. And this raises the bigger question about, how are we providing services to the family? Who's the appropriate person to provide services to the family? Like I said, there's a conflict of interest when we're representing the survivor of the forced marriage for us to be the one providing services, but there also still is space and a need for someone to be helping the family potentially and helping them understand, the challenges with this. So that's something else that comes up in these ACS cases. Another thing just to flag that came up in Farah's case is, just to kind of highlight some of the mental, and psychological challenges that can really go on, is she as part of her T visa, had to assert that her parents were traffickers and that they were abusive. And, again, she was doing that while she was still living in the home with her parents and while her parents were still really her support mechanism. And she didn't want anything negative to happen to her parents. She even became really concerned when there was a possibility of her parents getting deported. So, it's not straightforward. There's a lot of conflict that often goes on, particularly with minors who are trying to navigate these issues. And part of our role is doing the best we can to support them in that and trying to empower them to make the choices that are going to help them be the safest. And I will turn it over to my colleague now to talk a little bit more about this.
Thanks, Caroline. And just for everybody's notice, we realize we're not able to use the chat feature for this, so apologies, but you can continue to use the question and answer feature of the webinar. As Caroline mentioned, sometimes when Child Protective Services, child welfare gets involved, it might be the last time, right? The family may go in hiding, take the child, out of the school, leave the country. So it's really important. This might be the one chance really to advocate within the child welfare system to make sure that some actual results come through that could protect this child. It's important that we encourage that positive intervention by how we advocate from the beginning. So really bringing forward that this is a human rights abuse issue, a violation of due process clause of the United States, is something that we typically don't do when we're first, involving with child welfare system, but it's really important that we do that, right? Most caseworkers are not going to be thinking about these issues as they engage in a case like this. So really highlighting that importance is going to be that important for us as advocates that we bring that up. Also, it's going to be important that we bring up how sexual abuse is a consequence of this forced marriage. I still remember many of the cases that I've seen or where I was consulted in where there was absolutely no abuse apparent on the outside. The children, the child was well dressed, went to school, well fed, for all apparent purposes, this was not a case where child welfare would get involved. So really explaining, some of these consequences and where this is coming from is going to be important, but also it's the education as you're doing the work, right? Prepare affidavits from advocates that are doing this, connect them to other experts from community members who may know this, medical experts, and then, just bring in all the aspects that how to advocate with a child welfare worker. Sometimes it's going to be important to really go back to see if your state has some laws already on these issues, because initially this is not going to be the first response that a child welfare worker is going to be looking into when they engage with this family. It is really important that we also educate about some of the risks, right? They might be not thinking about what happens in a forced marriage, or that the family may, like Caroline said, leave the state altogether, take the child overseas. Those are risks that, they may need to be aware of that they may not immediately be tracking. So the most important thing is to know that this is your one chance and could be the one chance to engage the system. And, things are really important in that first intervention. And I think we're going to go into our second break right now.
Thank you so much, Mari Carmen. We are set to go on our second break before the next part. Wondering if you all would like to keep going and maybe push this break back a little bit. I'll wait to hear from you because I can't see you.
Oh, and I just learned that the chats are on, so maybe we could test that out.
That's great. Let me take a look. I haven't clicked on the chat because I know it's blocking. It's blocking the slides. So let's see if there's anything that we may want to answer now.
Okay, it's still not on. It continues to be disabled. Perhaps we could take that break and try to see if we could resolve that issue.
Yeah, let's take a break.
Okay, great. Then we can be back at about 4 or 5 at the 4:15 or the 15-minute mark.
Great. Let's take a break.
Thank you.
I realized the chats weren't on it and I turned them on. I don't know why they're not working now.
Hi there. I know that the box is back. That's because I have the chat and Q&A open so I can take a look. But I promise I'll stop looking at the chat once we get started. It appears that folks still have the chat disabled. However, I'm seeing Q&A be able to for folks to be able to utilize that. And I'm wondering if folks could perhaps use the Q&A to either ask questions or to comment anything that you may want us to see.
Yeah, will we start again? And could you just tell the attendees they should use the Q&A and instead of a chat?
Yeah, I don't know why the chat isn't functional because it's totally enabled. I'm trying to understand that there must be some other mechanism.
Yeah, it happens.
We're out of time. Is everyone back?
We're back.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna pass it back to you, Maricali.
Great. Thank you so much. And again, apologies for the chat inconvenience. We will try to answer as many questions as we can with the Q&A feature for the time being. I'm going to jump right into what we can do here in the United States. As it was mentioned before, you know, Halit's mentioned that in the UK, there's actual special protective orders for forced marriage. Well, we don't have that here in the United States, at least not yet. And so we have to make, when we're trying to look at protective orders, you know, we're trying to use something that exists to prevent domestic and family violence and try to use it to work within a forced marriage situation, which it's not going to fit quite, you know, neatly. So there's challenges for that reason, right? So for instance, protective orders that are for domestic violence or sexual assault or for stalking is not going to cover sometimes those situations where there is no past history of violence or there's a threat that is being made by a third party as well. Also, sometimes we may have, depending on the statute and the state, a victim may not have that necessary qualifying relationship to one of the perpetrators or to any of the perpetrators that may be involved in trying to arrange this marriage. So it's going to be one of those things that may not even be something that an individual could file for. And then there might be some other issues, and this might be true for any protective order, but to address something that may be happening in another country, or, you know, if somebody's applying, could you apply also to cover all of your siblings? So these are definitely some of the limitations that we see that may be more specific to a forced marriage protective order that may be able to be addressed in a different way. But we will use protective orders now because we do find that those are the most effective tools given what we have currently right now. So as we know, there's going to be impediments of being an underage litigant in any kind of situation. And, you know, it might be that as a minor, for many reasons, you know, they're not able to obtain their own legal relief. We need to make sure that they have standing, and each state has different standing provisions. So as we work on cases here at the Tahirih Justice Center, often we are looking at all these different impediments when we have a child that is looking at a potential forced marriage. Do they have the legal capacity to file this own suit, or do we need to bring in somebody that is going to be an adult representative in this case? And who do we bring in without outing this child who may be terrified to share this information with their family? Luckily, where the law is unclear, minors typically do have the ability to seek relief, but as you can see already, this is a really complicated process, and they're going to need some legal assistance to navigate what different options they may have and how to do it and what order, so that they can remain safe throughout that process as well. I'm going to talk briefly, and Halitz, if you can move it forward. Okay. Just as an example in Illinois, and the reason why I'm bringing up this example is that Halitz is actually going to move us into an actual case scenario that we were able to work in. And in this case, you know, these are the things that we had to look at as we were looking. Is a protective order a good and possible remedy for this child? You know, does the child have that qualifying relationship to the person who is forcing this marriage, and that we can refrain from doing so through a protective order? Is there a qualifying conduct through this statute for this child that will allow us to get what we need? And then, you know, what kind of standing does the minor have in Illinois to do a protective order on their own? And so lucky, you know, there's a full standing in Illinois. Whether the capacity is there, it's a little bit unclear. So erring on that side, there is some, that's something to kind of really be aware of. And if we can move to the next slide.
Thank you so much, Mari Carmen, and just wanted to note that some of this research that we have came from a colleague, Lisa Martin, who wrote the paper Restraining Forced Marriage, and we can certainly link that as a resource. But in thinking about what my colleagues have shared, what Mari Carmen just shared, gave Illinois as an example. As we know, often our biggest strength is to be creative and to see what options are truly available. And so we worked with a 16-year-old in Illinois who informed adults about her future fear of a forced marriage and future travel. In this case, she did have a protective adult who was able to take action, right? Who was able to utilize, the order of protection process on Lisa's behalf, and that protection order went through, and it was, against her parents. This is a unique way in which Lisa's case was handled by herself and by that protective adult. And it was not something that went through Department of Children and Family Services, although many folks thought that that was the correct course of action. Again, in her state, she was able to self-help, again, having that protective adult. Ultimately, a guardian ad litem was appointed, and Lisa's wishes were met, which for many, that could be so many different things, but for her goal was to avoid that travel. Her goal was to avoid the marriage, right? And so in utilizing that order of protection process, by having that adult who was willing to assist her, they were able to make the appropriate request to withhold travel documents to keep Lisa in the same school, right? And she had the option to live at home or to live with that helpful, adult. And she actually chose to stay at home, which for many that could be, shocking. But again, these cases are ones where you're talking about, children and their parents, right? And for the most part, they're wanting, the abuse or the fear of what's coming to stop, but they don't want to necessarily cut ties with parents, at least not in every case. And for her, it was also very important to leverage her rights and to reset the boundaries within her household, so that it was clear that she had, options, with her parents, and thinking about, they control every step, of her life. And in this situation, again, she was able to utilize, what the state that she was in allows her to be able to reset those boundaries and to find the success. And what that meant for her was to be able to stop that travel, to stay in the same school district, and to have now more eyes, on this type of situation. And again, staying with her family.
Yes, thank you, Halitz. And I think there are so many different ways that we can approach this, right? And Halitz mentioned one, even though there was a protective order and a guardian and so forth, still staying with the family was what was important to this child, and in a way that it was able to be resolved to do that. Again, looking at our protective orders and like what's available, again, this is not the best fit. And usually when you apply for a protective order, there's going to be, those enumerated existing already protections, like not to commit additional family violence, not to threaten violence, not to harass, not to go to the school or work or any of those things. However, what can really help, right, in the existing protective orders that we have right now is those catch-all provisions that many states allow. And that's where you can come in with the solution of, what does the child really need, right? What other things might actually grant the relief that the child needs to be protected in their home, you know, and if we want to advance to the next slide, Helene. And some of the other potential remedies outside of the protective order context is going to be to really look at the juvenile court system. Sometimes a child can do their own petitions, right? Alleging abuse and neglect by their parents, or file a chintz petition for services or supervision, or of course, the seeking of an emancipation. For each one of these different options, it's so important to do the pros and cons and discuss those options with a child who may be scared and have already lost so much of, you know, the autonomy and the ability to make decisions on what's going to happen. So having a really good understanding of what each of these options may mean and what that would mean for this child in that situation is going to be incredibly important. Next slide, please. Before taking any steps, and I think I just mentioned that in the past, how important it is and how empowering it is to give a little bit of control again to this individual who is losing or feels like they're losing all of their options, to really feel like they understand what's happening and what is going to happen at every step of the way, as much as you can do that. One of the real big practice tips really is, as you're advocating, you have to be educating. Not all of the people in the system, including judges and others who are typically involved in helping children stay safe, are familiar with what happens during a forced marriage and how to prevent it. So it's incredibly important that you're always educating. Submit a detailed affidavit of the person who is facing this forced marriage. And, you know, as you're doing this, it's really important to not forget to safety plan. You know, as the child is telling you what they believe will happen, I mean, that's an opportunity to try to see what they can do in the moment. Because many times they're still living at home, navigating the system where they could be in danger. So really planning on where will they go, how will they call for help, you know, programming, you know, a place where they can find your number to call you back again, should they be relocated to a different country, or if they end up going to a family or a friend of the family without any ability to contact you. So those are things to really include. And the importance for the affidavit as well is that, you know, you can spend the time to really outline all of the information that the child will need when it comes time to bring this before a judge. And the other thing is, like, include supporting affidavits. Look for your experts in the community, those individuals that may be from the same culture, other people that can testify as to what could happen in a situation like this. Some of the remedies that you can request in a forced marriage, of course, in some of these we already know from international parental kidnapping prevention, is you can request to turn the child's passport over to the court, prohibit foreign travel, prohibit relevant coercive conduct. You know, all of the things that there could be doing that you may try to prohibit. This is where that catch-all provision of the protective order can come into place, including the one where you can require that the child remains in school. And again, these are just a couple of examples, but looking and speaking to the child in this case is going to be your biggest guide as to what you need to do. Next slide.
Yeah. And so in thinking about everything that was just shared, I wanted to discuss a case with you all. I'm not going to read the case example, but I'll talk a bit as you all take a look at this slide, which is of a former client who was 16 years old and knew that a marriage was, you know, going to be pushed upon her. And so the her parents were consistently pushing. She attempted to reason with them, but nothing was changing. And she, thought to get the help of someone, at her high school, and they attempted to utilize traditional processes by contacting the abuse hotline. And in this case, an investigation was not open. They, when the hotline was called, they did not see cause. And it's often the case whenever someone is, bringing up this future fear, where, folks are not necessarily so well educated to understand that there is perhaps, other forms of abuse that may be present, or other ways of providing support. And so, we had a client, was a minor, but who had an adult in their life who was willing to be that next friend, or to be that guardian. And so before, we took on, some, legal protections, we met with her, discuss, her fears, and really what led to those fears, right? To think creatively, what else can she tell us that perhaps meets a definition of abuse in that state, that meets perhaps a definition of neglect? What else is there of the family history, or what she knows, or how does she know that this marriage, is coming? And often, the folks who we're working with, even adults, don't necessarily have like an invitation that you can show, but they just know that it's coming because it's happened to other family members, or because their parents have regularly talked about it. And so again, in thinking about, what legal or non-legal actions they should take, we sit and discuss, and in this case, discuss very carefully all the pros and cons, and what would be associated with each choice, which is very important, especially with minors, as often, folks are making decisions for them without really thinking about how they could be impacted, or how it would impact, their household. And so, again, we had a client who had an adult who was willing to come forward, who was willing to be able to be the next friend or that guardian. And in this case, our family law attorney did a CHINS petition, right? What Mari Carmen just talked about, which essentially is really, a step down from Child Protective Services fully intervening and fully putting someone, in removal and foster care. It really is a sort of a way to say, what, this is, a case where, the courts need to have an eye on, or more systems need to perhaps have an eye on this child. And there should be some types of protection that, keep them, in the same home, which is what this young lady also wanted, but also where there are protections like what was shared, right? Removal of passports, not being able to remove her out of the state without court permission, right? It's not necessarily full Child Protective Services involvement, but by having that family law attorney step in, we were able to get this young lady to have some systems, involved to protect her. And we understand that CHINS is not necessarily something that is that is available in every state, but really the key takeaway here is about safety, right? And it's about creative advocacy, right? And how do we utilize the options that we have and our own expertise to be able to identify these solutions. And so, although every state does not have CHINS, there are some special remedies, and we'll pass it back to Mari Carmen to talk about what she does have in Texas.
Thank you, Halit. And this I am really excited about. In 2017, really in large part due to the advocacy that Tahirih did on this issue, several bills became law that made the legal marriage age in Texas 18. It was not totally 18 and that's it, because it also allowed for situations in which a court granted emancipation. So 18 or otherwise a court grants emancipation. But along with this change in the law in Texas, other parts of the statute started to change. One of them that also changed was the definition of child abuse. It also came as a result of some of that advocacy, and it included in the definition of child abuse specifically forcing or coercing a child to enter into marriage. So this kind of really gives us an opportunity now not only to advocate within the child welfare system, but I know, because I've seen like their new case disposition guidelines, that there is actual more information for child welfare workers to start looking at this issue in a very different way. Whereas before it was really hard to like try to convince them that this is also something that they needed to be looking at. So now that just has created an opening for greater advocacy, understanding, and education about what this means and how we can really truly protect a child that may be in this kind of situations. Again, because I like I mentioned earlier, early on, there was very little that we can do, because on the outside of it, like there was no abuse that could be, seen for child welfare to be involved, and then going to the family would actually create a lot more problems. So this just creates something that is really unique and very exciting for us here in Texas. The other thing that's important is that because this became part of the definition of what child abuse is, in Texas, you can also file for a family violence protective order on behalf of a minor, where certain things are there, including child abuse as defined here when there's forcing or coercing to enter into child marriage. So this is not something, it's in the books, but we haven't gone there to do that yet. But this is actually a really great opening of where we could be going in other states, as well as these laws continue to change, and we're adapting to see what's best practice. And, this means also the fact that this is in the child abuse statute, that it's not just going to be, the private attorney or a legal aid attorney who might find out, or somehow the child gets to us and are able to advocate, but this also gives the means for the CPS worker to work with the department to get a protective order on behalf of this child, or any other adult that can file for the protection order on behalf of this minor. So really exciting things on this area here in Texas. This is something that, though, we still need to be very cognizant of, is that for the most part, marriages are still going to be recognized in Texas if they go and marry somewhere else and then come back as a married minor. And I say for the most part, because just recently we became aware, or I became aware of a Court of Appeals case out of the First District here in the Houston area, where the court did not recognize a marriage that happened outside of Texas. This is the case of Broussard v. Arnell, and I'll put the citation. And in that case, the court did not recognize the marriage that happened outside of Texas without the emancipation that is necessary under the statute. But the one thing that you also need to know, whether or not this is going to happen, or the family might take the child out of state to consummate or have a marriage occur, is that with protective orders, we can request to prevent that interstate travel of a child, or we can try to prevent the overseas so that the marriage does not happen in another country.
Thank you so much, Mari Carmen, for sharing about this unique protections, and hopefully, as folks are thinking about, the work in their state, this is something that hopefully can spread and be helpful in other areas. As we move forward to the next slide, it's a video, another case example that shifts the conversation slightly, as this survivor did not, or to have an immigration component. And I think it's important, as we think about, the survivors who we work with, that we also think of these type of cases as well. And so look to the group to let me know if you can hear, and hopefully everyone can see the video.
When people think of forced marriage, they think of, a lot of physical violence. And for me, it was more manipulation and psychological abuse, emotional abuse to get me to a point where they wanted me to be. Women are not allowed to have an opinion. Women are not allowed to be free. Women are not allowed to move around freely or to do anything without permission. We're taught a lot of things like you're in the world but not of it, which means you can go shopping, you can have work acquaintances with people that are not of this belief system, but they are not your friend, and you have to be on guard against anything that they might say or try and influence, and you need to be the light that tries to draw them into our, holier lifestyle. Force in my life took on this form of very intense family pressure and manipulation and, psychological control, which had been fostered since I was a child, to not make my own decisions, to not trust my instincts, and to feel like there was nowhere I could go. I could not run away from that situation. There was nowhere to hide. And so you go along with it. We were allowed to speak on the phone every other day for about 4 or 5 days, and then my father had me come up to Michigan to meet this man's family, and spent the weekend with that family, and then flew back down, was able to talk for a couple more days over the phone. And every time I would say something like, I don't think we really get along. Oh, you'll get better after the wedding because you can start dating after the wedding. Oh, don't worry, he'll change after the wedding. Oh, don't worry, you just have cold feet, it will be better after the wedding. And so I just kept feeling like, okay, I don't really want this, I'm not in love with this person, but it's going to get better after the wedding. I felt at the time that I couldn't give up my family for independence. And, that after all, this is what I'd been raised for, this is what I was supposed to be doing, this is what God wanted for my life. Obviously, if my entire family thinks this is what God wants for me, who am I to say that I know better than them what God wants? She started to help me identify what was really going on in my life. I would tell her about something and she would say, do you realize that that's abuse? And that was the first time that it dawned on me that what I was going through was abuse. I got up that morning and I looked at my children sleeping, and I knew that I was going to change their life forever, and that was on me. They didn't know that we were being abused. They didn't know that our whole lifestyle was abusive, and that my girls were not going to be given choices.
So in thinking of Nina's case and what we've heard throughout today's presentation, it's a lot of what my colleagues have shared in thinking about the different forms of abuse that she faced, the social ostracism that she also faced. and the connections to adequate services that ultimately helped her in her journey. But here, I freeze this last a snippet of the video to highlight, the annulment that she was ultimately able to obtain. And this annulment, was not easy at all. It took, again, creative advocacy and thinking of how to support her. And, no one thought that the annulment would be possible. And what ultimately happened is, we connected her legal team to that team of Rebecca Musser, who is known, as a survivor advocate, as she was married to a leader in the FLDS. And in that connection, that connecting that attorney to that other legal team is what led her attorney to understanding that this truly was forced, and the very onset of that marriage was without her consent. Also, in thinking of creative advocacy, creative lawyering, her attorney utilized the fact that Nina had kept journals throughout before marriage and throughout her marriage, and essentially shared with the husband and and his legal team that they would make those journals public, and that for them was enough to also grant Nina's wishes, because they did not want the public to learn about what she had written down, what she had experienced, what she had faced. And so if I can chat here with my colleague Mari Carmen a little bit about just helping folks remember and think about agency, and again the importance of explaining pros and cons in folks when they're terminating a forced marriage.
Thank you, Halitz. And I think, definitely this case, Nina's case, is really like an example of what we should be doing, because after 11 years of marriage, I think most practitioners would just say, you just need to get a divorce. This is what you need to do. But again, talking about giving the survivor agency, talking about what's really important to them in this next step after so much has been robbed and taken away from them, it's going to be like key and essential. So whether that looks like a divorce or a legal separation where there's no ultimate divorce, we've had those types of situations as well, or an annulment. And even in some situations where they just want the violence to stop, but for whatever reason, they want to keep the marriage, filing a protective order that does not have a stay away provision might be the way to go in some instances. So the key really is to have those kinds of conversations, and then look at what laws you have and how to creatively get to that possible solution. And surprisingly, sometimes we are able to do those remedies that the survivor seeks, like here in Nina's case, which I'm sure many people questioned if that was even going to be possible to do with children and so many years in the marriage. So definitely talk to your client and find a creative way to try to reach that solution, or to empower them to understand those options, so that they can feel again that they're regaining some of that empowerment that was taken away from them.
Thank you. I'll pass it to Caroline to talk to us about Harriet's case.
Yeah, so this is another case example that we wanted to share with you, involving a case where the individual was not a minor, she was an adult, but she was being forced into a marriage by her father. And so this client was born and raised in Brooklyn, but her family was from Yemen. And her father had actually taken them on a family trip to Yemen, and left the mother there, and then abducted the children back to the US. And so when they came back to the US, Harriet was effectively the matriarch of the family. She had to do a lot of the cooking and cleaning every day. She did have an older sibling, but that sibling suffered from cerebral palsy. And so she was really the one who was left with all of these duties. So much so that she actually had to drop out of high school. She couldn't attend high school because these duties were so overwhelming. But she fought hard with her father to still be able to get a GED. And so she did that online. And so as part of this, her father had promised her to an older Yemen man against her will. And, you know, prior to this, she had suffered while she had lived in the home with her father, physical abuse and also verbal abuse. So Harriet actually managed to escape. You can go to the next slide. So she actually managed to escape and get to DV shelter. The problem was that her father kept finding her, and it wasn't just her father looking for her, it was also extended family and her brothers. So first we got her placed in a trafficking shelter. Her father found her. We then moved her to another shelter. Her father found her again. And finally, we moved her to a third shelter in Long Island, which was quite a bit further away from where her father's home was located. And so we were able to get her some physical separation in this sense, but we also needed to try and get an order of protection. And it was very much so an uphill battle, trying to convince a family court judge in New York why this individual, who was an adult, needed an order of protection from her family. And, you know, so we had to really try and educate the court on the nature of the abuse going on, how they were continuing to stalk her and find her and try and bring her back into this marriage and force her to go forward with this marriage. Another thing that we did with this client was help safety plan with her so that she could continue to go to school. And so for this client, being able to continue her education at Queens College really was important and really ended up being a way for her to find freedom and autonomy. And so her father and siblings found her at Queens College and actually approached her on Queens College campus. So part of what we did was coordinating with school administrators, specifically the Title IX office there, and talking with them about safety planning, ensuring that these individuals weren't allowed on the campus, making public safety aware of who these individuals were, her father, her brothers, so that they couldn't, if they came onto campus, that she would have some protection. And so for this client, we were able to get the order of protection from family court. Ultimately, what happened is that after having a temporary order of protection for several months, the father finally agreed to a permanent 2-year order of protection. You know, and I think finally, like I said, after a lot of advocacy, the judge and the court were able to see why this was needed, how there really was threats to her life and continued harassment going on. And then the other piece of it was helping her feel safe at Queens College and helping her complete her education there. And so she actually was able to graduate from Queens College and is now working full time. And so for this client, a lot of the advocacy we did, in addition to the order of protection, was really around helping her get that education and complete that education. So now she can have some freedom and autonomy from her family and be able to move forward.
Thank you, Caroline. And so before we wrap for any Q&A, it's very important for us to go back and ground us in the work that we do. And so we see our role in prevention and healing, whether at whatever level that may be, whether we're case management, therapists, attorneys. It's so important to have a conversation with those who we're working with based on trust and based on respect. We encourage folks to really root yourself in non-judgmental point of view about the person, about the family, about the culture, or the community they may be discussing with you. It's important to be knowledgeable about resources and options, and provide information and make referrals or make those connections when possible. We know that this webinar is really about being creative and thinking about what options are available in the state or country that you are in, but again, thinking about how we can make some sort of connection for that survivor to have folks who can safety plan and who could do perhaps address, I should say, some of the issues that they're coming forward with. We always name it's important to educate about rights, educate about laws, and even if it's simple points like what is on the screen, you may be the first person telling the person at risk that they have a right to say no to a marriage or marriage partner that they do not want. They have a right to leave a marriage that they do not want. We believe that no religion sanctions forced marriage, and intercourse is not an obligation in marriage, and rape and sexual assault can occur within a marriage. You'd be surprised how powerful naming that for folks can be. And again, doing what we can to be creative as we identify solutions and options. When we're talking about taking that survivor-centered approach, we always keep in mind that the process for help seeking, the process for trying to leave, for stopping, for exiting a forced marriage can be extremely traumatic. There's so much that the survivor is thinking about. They're thinking about leaving their only home, the only community they have ever known, that they have been told about how the horrible things that would happen if they're on their own. And the reality is that it is a loss for them to think about having to leave those loved ones behind who are also causing harm. They could be lacking in life experience and resources, whether they are minors or adults, right? They may never have had the opportunity to work, right, or manage money, or live outside of the family. And so if they're interacting with you, they may not know some of the things that we may see as basic knowledge. And so again, educating is so incredibly important. Likely they are fearing for siblings, for friends that would be left behind, and potentially have been threatened that if they do not go forward with the marriage, or if they seek help, that it's going to be passed on to someone else. Again, they're facing conflicted feelings about family, about loved ones, about their own identity and what it means to report or talk to others about what's happening, and certainly worried about their future, worried about what would happen to them, where they would go. The idea of shelter is very scary, even when those options are available. Often in our work, we are ready for second thoughts. Again, folks may backtrack their decisions, but that doesn't mean that we will stop helping them. And we see this also when we have connected clients to, family law services, and when it's that time to, finalize things, that person may backtrack as they're worried, and that's okay. We would never tell a domestic violence survivor they couldn't, seek help if they, return to the partner who is abusive. And so it's important to be ready for those second thoughts, and again, to continue to have, compassion and empathy, and remember that this is a very scary decision when folks are bringing up these concerns, when they're asking for help. They're very brave, and it is still a scary moment. And so we're here to help. The Forced Marriage Initiative information is on the screen. You can always connect with fmi@tahirih.org, whether that be to connect with iProgram directly, whether it be to connect with a Tahirih attorney who may have expertise in this issue, or you may need more creative solutions and need that TA support. And we also have our website that includes lots of different research and information there as well. My colleagues with Sanctuary for Families have also included their information if you're working with someone, and again, just need that additional technical assistance, whether that be just for you directly, or again, if you're needing to, or someone who you're working with could benefit from a referral. And so I'm going to pause here and see if my colleagues, if there's anything extra you would like to share or wrap us up with before going into Q&A. So I am going to stop sharing screen so that I can actually see you all. And again, thank you all for being here, and to my colleagues here. Let me go ahead and take a look at the Q&A, or if there's anything that's come up that you have been able to see already, you can ask the question and maybe take it as a group.
There's two questions. One's pending. I'll just go ahead and ask the panelists as well. That has not completely been answered. One, are there reported state court decisions in the U.S. about forced marriage or forced pregnancy that we can recommend? I, shared what we know about Broussard v. Arnell, which is a Texas case that somewhat speaks to it, but I was not able to think of any actual reported decision, at least not on the issue of forced marriage. You're muted. Yeah.
Did you hear me now? I can't think of another one either, and that is honestly the cases that I've seen have where forced marriage has been somewhat tucked in. There are cases of female genital mutilation and cutting, and perhaps some cases where it's named as trafficking, but not necessarily forced marriage. And so I can certainly go back to the team and see if there's anything else that is missing. But that I think if we had something that we could point to, we would know, honestly. And for the most part, at least in my work, I've seen this issue really be not named, but tucked in, right? And the survivors maybe naming it as forced marriage, but it's being named as domestic violence, as stalking, is being named as, female genital mutilation and cutting, and not necessarily, as a standalone issue for the most part.
I mean, from today's webinar, I think the panelists offered us as a new perspective to look at what forced marriages are. And there's actually, I think for most of us, we are pretty familiar with annulment case laws in which marriages were contracted under duress or coercion. I think today, after this webinar, we ought to think back and what those coercions and duresses meant, and whether those marriages were forced marriage, and maybe we can develop a new jurisprudence to help us to help our clients with their forced marriage cases, and educate ourselves and the courts.
Helly, it's the other question that I see that it's still outstanding. I know that you were navigating the slides, and so I just want to elevate it. Is do any of the panelists know if any of the state statutes that have codified coercive control as part of the definition of domestic violence reference forced marriage explicitly?
Yeah, thank you. And Mari Carmen, that's another one that I believe if we would have forced marriage named specifically, that we would know. And so I don't believe, and though I can't say 100%, given that we haven't done the deep research, I don't think that is the case. It's given that our program is national and all the folks who we work with, it's it's unfortunate that we don't know 100%, but given our work, I think we would have known, and we wouldn't have had to get so creative in the ways that we're advocating for survivors. I did receive a direct message, and I'll ask to the group. There was a question regarding, thinking about, children who are non-citizen children who are forced to marry. And if I can't see the full question, but his talk is wanting to address non-citizen children. And so I'm wondering if anyone could speak to some of the additional pieces that we may need to consider.
I can speak just briefly because of like a similar case scenario where we are maybe looking at something similar. If it just depends on all of the facts, but if this is a child who is unaccompanied as a minor and it's just here without a parent, there might be some issues as to like who would actually, who would the child be living with? It would Child Protective Services have, jurisdiction to come in? Would anybody else be able to do that? Would it be, ORR? I mean, I think like that could get a little bit more complex depending on who would have the ability to, if there's somebody else to step in the shoes, depending on the age of the child, or if this child is old enough to be emancipated. There's just might be different options based on, the age of the child, the situation. Is the child here alone? Or are there other family members or other individuals that might be able to step in a situation like this?
Up a lot.
There's another question about the materials for this webinar. I believe ABA will make it available to all attendees. And also, if there are any best statutes for our Michigan legislature to adopt to protect against child marriage, and Malik Carmen review the Texas statutes for us. I think that would be a great model for me as a states to look into. Malik Carmen, yeah.
Yeah, and we're also happy to share, through our Forced Marriage Initiative and our policy team, if this is something that you're interested in doing, and of course not committing our team to go in and do this policy work, but definitely to visit with you, to talk things through, to see, some of the steps that were taken in some of the states where we have been actively advocating on these issues, and definitely do that. Of course, there's also ABA policy that could be adopted internally. So there's different avenues of how we can start making deeper changes that could impact and really, whether it's forced marriage or child marriage, those are important issues to address. And as y'all can tell, as practitioners, is that it's not a simple solution. And right now we're having to create something that doesn't quite exist from other tools that we have. So really exciting what we can all do when we come together and put our brain trust to create something that can really make a difference to so many.
Yes, thank you so much, Maria Carmen. That is part of what our program does, a large part of what our Senior Policy Associate, Alex Goyette, is involved in. We're closely monitoring, child marriage laws across the nation, monitoring bills, and connecting survivor advocates who are themselves leading campaigns, who are also offering testimony, and, at times offering that, technical assistance on the side. At times we're more, in person, such as right now, we have a campaign in Washington, D.C. And in other places, we are really helping to build coalition, to build, working with practitioners on the ground, working with service providers so that we can offer what we've learned, and knowing that, if we don't have an office there, then, your state best, right? And so, the issues that are important, to your, the constituents. And so we are certainly a resource as well. If you're thinking about the laws in your state, marriage laws, age of consent laws, all of these things that could be helpful, child abuse definitions, protective order processes, all of these are helpful. And often, again, our clients are looking to civil protections. I did see another comment, related to other work that's being done. We are heavily involved in looking, to, what does criminalization look like? And is that something that is helpful? Again, that is not an easy question to answer. That is something that we do have to convene with partners like Sanctuary for Families, with survivors, with folks who are experts to really think about how communities are going to be, treated or penalized. And so that's very important for us to take a very careful approach. And we're also looking at the immigration system, right? And thinking about how can we strengthen laws there that do allow for minors to, be, exploited.
Hi, Ms. Hall, if you'd like to ask your question to the panelists, go right ahead. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, I don't have a question. I was transitioning from my computer to my car, so it must have unmuted me.
Okay. All right. No problem. Thank you. Well,
Okay.
oh, okay. Miss Sadowski, do you have a question?
No, I do not, but thank you. You answered.
Okay. All right. Thanks. All right.
There is a question that I just see on the Q&A. It says, I believe in the beginning of the presentation, someone mentioned that they have been able to obtain child support for survivors of child marriages. Was this in reference to the spouse of the child, or was it in reference to the parent of the child who was forced into the marriage that was ordered by the court to pay child support? How successful has it been to get child support for these kinds of cases?
So this, we reference this in one of our case examples, and it's something that we have just started exploring. So it's specific to New York State. That's where the client was that we were working with. And it was specifically getting child support from the parent. I don't know, Busha, if you want to add any more on that.
Yeah, it's like a new unprecedented case. So we are working on that hot off the press. But it's also one in which, we're looking at, so this is for children who are under the age of 21 who have separated from their parents. And particularly there has to be a history of violence, right? So there is also like duress, there is like violence, a lot of extreme forms of child abuse and neglect that has happened that has led the child to leave her family home. And so I think that's, key, particularly in this child support case. So that's something that we're working on with our client. And it is, it's not been easy. We'll say that, like, we have not completed this case, and it is definitely something that we are working on. And we encourage you to think about and look into your state laws, particularly regarding child support. And again, this would be extremely helpful because this is a at-risk forced marriage survivor who left and is a full-time student and full-time working, and really trying to manage all of her responsibilities. So again, receiving that child support money would be crucial, right? In her independence and being able, and allowing her to continue her education. So it's just another out of the box sort of like, example and suggestion that we're looking into. Of course, reach out to us. So I know our family law attorneys, Caroline, and we have another family law attorney that's working on this case, who can really sort of guide you through our process and the court papers and documents that we have submitted. But thank you. Yeah.
Just to add a little bit about the adults who we work with, often it's really been, for lack of better words, the typical family law process, right? And working with an attorney who understands the complexities of the case, but also is utilizing the typical process to get the client attempt to get the child support. And I think it goes back to that point that Mari Carmen made earlier when thinking about someone terminating a forced marriage, right? Are there avenues that would make the child support easier, right? The family law process, the easier, the child custody, all those pieces, right? When thinking about separating or annulment, are there any other pieces that perhaps would be more beneficial, right? And important for the client to understand that. In working with survivors who were married as children, often they have shared that they did not receive child support, that often they were battling to get their children, that the perpetrator, the man they were forced to marry, was granted custody. They were a child, they were, young, and that person had, was older, they had money, they had a house, they had a job. And so that is often what we hear, that it's not till years and years later where they are perhaps better connected to resources, better connected to a proper attorney, to social services, where they have been able to, continue to fight for whatever they're able to obtain at that time. And so I see someone asking about Michigan, and so we certainly will share reports. There is one of the links, that tahirih.org/child marriage, does include a report that summarizes child marriage laws, and so happy to message with you further or connect you with our policy associate to give you maybe more information on Michigan and anybody who may be working in that state at this time, or coalitions that may be forming that you may be able to be part of.
I noticed there is also, I guess, a comment and somewhat of a question. I'm assuming on the child support issue that it's interesting. Would this be based on an equitable argument, I guess, in the New York state, in the New York case that you mentioned, for instance, in Illinois, marriage is an emancipating event which negates child support from parents. And I'm not sure, Caroline or Bushra, both of you, since you worked on this case, if that played into it, the emancipating event that marriage could be, and if that was part of the considerations in the support matter.
From what I can remember, particularly with this case, is because there's a history of extreme child abuse and neglect. I'm not sure if it negates the emancipation, but again, I think that's the initial reason why this child left, who's again an adult who's under the age of 21 and seeking child support. So again, I think that New York also has emancipation laws, and Caroline, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But again, because of the extreme forms of violence and abuse that she suffered, along with the coercion and, trying to ensure that the marriage takes place, like that is the reason why we're able to put in this child support law. And it kind of almost if I'm right. Okay, all right. Yeah, if you want to add, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just second what you're saying, Bushra. I think that's correct.
Yeah. So hopefully that answers your question. And again, that's state specific. So again, we're looking at state specific laws. Yeah.
Okay, I don't think we have any open question in Q&A. I have just a quick question if the panelists can answer. When a child first approaches us attorneys, it is a very delicate situation. I wonder if you have any advice to share with us on how to handle that first contact. For instance, when would be a good time to call Sanctuary for Families or Tahirih for help to secure legal representation for that child?
I was going to let the attorney speak first, but I can add. And my initial, reaction is, I would say connect as soon as possible. Often I get emails, my program gets emails for folks who are not, they don't have consent to share more, but at least, hey, I need some technical assistance. Hypothetically speaking, if I have a 16-year-old coming to me for, ABC, right? And that helps us be able to also connect to other experts in that state, be able to identify, the right, potential options, right? And together then give, proper guidance, right? So I would say the sooner, the better. It is a delicate situation. And at times attorneys, at least in my experience, have been better served by also connecting to other attorneys who have worked on similar cases, right? And getting that technical assistance directly is incredibly helpful, and having the time to connect to the right experts is also helpful. For our program, you can refer someone of any age at any time. You can give the FMI Tahirih email. You can, give our website, and from there, we will do what we possibly can to ensure that person knows their rights and options, and at least get some sort of information on safety planning, on next steps, and help them better think about what's possible for them as we still think about the complexities of maybe a legal matter, right? It's so important to also offer that safety planning. And often, young people are trusting of those who, may know better. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we do know better, because it is their life. And they also have to make the assessment of what is truly best for them. And they know best, their families. And so that's, for me, is really important in working with young people and treating them with respect, and also being honest about the limitations of some of the things that they may want.
Thank you, Halit. And I think one of the things that first came to mind, when the question came up, or when you posed that question to me, is like, it probably takes a lot of courage for this young person to reach out and get on the call. And if you don't know the answers, immediately, as soon as possible, definitely connect them to us or to others who do, because this might be the only time that they reach out for help, and the response and how they're treated in this situation could really, either cement what they've been told, nobody's going to listen to you, etc. So we want to make sure that they're treated, and like how you communicate with them is in a way that will encourage them to continue to seek help or assistance from somebody else. Even if you're not the one that's going to be able to do that, find a way to communicate, a way that it's going to be safe. If you're going to communicate and give some resources to somebody who might be able to do that, make sure that you get all that information in that very first contact, so that you can do that and let this individual know that there are people that can help and that we are here to help. So.
I guess I would just add about, just letting them know that it's a coordinated effort, but again, everything really falls on, the survivor and what they want, right? Because I feel like a lot of times we're talking about legal options and other remedies. And, we also work with a lot of forced marriage survivors and child marriage survivors who are continually living with their families, and sort of like, how do we do that harm reduction? How are we talking about ways that they can remain safe, communicating with family members, but also a team of adults that they're still connected with, right? So again, like creating that that safety plan, but that safety plan might also include healthy adults in other ways. So it's not, I would say majority of my cases is also working with making sure that we're using that continuum. We're constantly checking in every week. We're letting them know that these are their options. And again, whenever they're ready, that they can take those. And I worked with people, if it takes like years for them to take those steps, a couple of months or maybe, right? And again, that choice that they make, and how do we sort of respect and honor autonomy? And, just also like, in New York, we worked with adult survivors who are at risk of a forced marriage, and took us years to be able to get an order of protection for them, right? So again, there's a lot of work in which we're doing to change culturally, like shifts in the way judges are perceiving, right? Or a forced marriage, and seeing this as like a form of gender-based violence. Because again, people really just see this as like an isolated incident. This is the marriage, let's address the issue of the marriage. But again, there's so much, right? And I'm hoping that today's, webinar really sort of sheds light about the complex, right? Like trauma histories. We get a lot of IPV and other forms of gender-based violence survivors, and there's a lot of complex trauma histories that we're really trying to sift through. And oftentimes, those are some of the things as attorneys, like, and service providers, we want to think about, like, how is that, even the remedies that we're suggesting, how does that really, impact in terms of like what our clients have experienced, right? Other forms, and, what will happen about leaving or not leaving, and how do they maintain safety? Who are the people that can reach out to? Are there any safe family members? Because sometimes there are, and those are things that we kind of uncover as we are doing more of a thorough assessment of their situation, and really, constantly safety planning and looking at that continuum and seeing, how close or how imminent is the risk of a child or forced marriage. Yeah.
I'll just plug before we wrap. I don't know where everyone is joining from, but our program is national, and that may mean that we may be working with someone right in your backyard. And so if you, as you're listening to this webinar and thinking about how you would work with someone, if you're someone that we could, count on for, perhaps that pro bono support and working with a survivor, we're happy to connect with you and work together and hopefully, help those who are contacting us and who need this support. Often, folks are nervous, they don't see themselves as expert, but we all have tools in our toolkit, and it takes a lot of just willingness and that creative advocacy and that willingness to work together and to learn from each other. And often that's all, we need to help those who are, coming to us for support. So thank you everyone for joining. I really appreciate everyone's time.
Thank you for the panelists. This would conclude our webinar. And on behalf of ABA International Family Law Committee, I would like again thank our panelists for sharing their experience and their knowledge. And we look forward to working together on these important issues. Thank you very much. And thank you for attending today's webinar.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.